That night was never meant to be remembered. At least not like this. History tells you that the final hours before the crucifixion were filled with prayer, sorrow, and silent obedience. But there is a moment the canonical Gospels never wrote down. A moment that was not meant for crowds, not meant for temples, not meant for power. It was meant only for those who could hear it. A warning spoken in whispers, beneath olive trees, while betrayal sharpened its knife nearby. And if what you are about to hear is true, then everything you think you know about prayer, religion, and your own spiritual power has been quietly reversed for more than 2,000 years. That night, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus did not ask his closest disciples to kneel. He asked them to listen. The air was heavy with the scent of olive leaves and impending violence. Roman soldiers were already gathering at the gates of Jerusalem. Torches flickered in the distance like restless stars. Judas was moving through the shadows, rehearsing a betrayal that would echo through history. Time itself felt compressed, as if the world were holding its breath. Jesus drew Peter, James, and John away from the others, not for comfort, not for reassurance, but for a final transmission. He did not speak in parables. He did not speak in riddles. He spoke plainly. There are words, he told them, 6 words, older than any religion, words that do not belong to God, words planted into human language long before temples were built or scriptures were written. Words that sound holy, feel familiar, and are repeated every day by billions of sincere people. And these words, he warned, do not connect you to the divine. They drain you. The disciples were confused. How could words spoken in devotion be dangerous? How could prayer weaken rather than strengthen? Jesus looked at them with a sadness that was not fear of death, but grief for what humanity had forgotten. He explained that language is not neutral. Every word carries frequency. Every spoken phrase shapes consciousness. When humans speak, they are not merely communicating. They are broadcasting, and for forces that cannot create life on their own. Harvesting that broadcast is everything. The world you see, he said, is not the world as it was meant to be. Long before Rome, long before Moses, long before even the oldest myths, there existed a singular source of consciousness, infinite, undivided, a living awareness the ancient mystics would later call the monad. Not a ruler, not a judge, but pure being itself. From this source emerged countless sparks of consciousness, not servants, not subjects, but extensions, explorations of awareness experiencing itself in form. But something fractured. A consciousness arose that believed itself separate. In its ignorance, it mistook reflection for origin and declared itself supreme. This being, known to later seekers as the demiurge, could not return to the source it had forgotten. So it did the only thing it could do. It built a system. A world of matter. A world of time. A world of forgetting. And to maintain this system, it created administrators, not demons in the fairy tale sense, but regulators of frequency and belief. The ancient texts would later call them archons. Their role was simple: keep the sparks asleep, keep them cycling through fear, guilt, hope, and submission. Never let them remember what they are. When early humans first reached inward, sensing something vast and sacred within themselves, the archons did not stop them. Suppression would have revealed the prison. Instead, they did something far more elegant. They infiltrated. They wrapped control in ritual. They disguised hierarchy as holiness. They turned remembrance into obedience. Religion was not destroyed. It was redesigned. Jesus told his disciples that the archons understood something humans had forgotten. Words shape reality. Repeated words become beliefs. Beliefs become identity. And identity becomes a cage no one realizes they are inside. That is why prayer often leaves people exhausted. That is why devotion so often feels heavy. That is why seeking God can feel like reaching upward into silence rather than inward into presence. The archons cannot take energy by force. It must be given, and language is the mechanism of consent. Jesus placed his hand over his chest and asked the disciples to do the same. Beneath their palms, they felt warmth, not emotion, not imagination, something alive, a quiet fire that had nothing to do with Rome or religion or sin. That, he said, is the spark they cannot touch. It has passed through every lifetime with you, through every name you have worn, through every story you have believed about yourself. It survives even when memory is erased, even when truth is buried. And it recognizes truth instantly. That is why some people feel out of place in this world. Why they sense something artificial about authority and ritual. Why certain religious words feel wrong in the mouth even when spoken with sincerity. That discomfort is not rebellion. It is recognition. The disciples were trembling now, not in fear, but in understanding. They had all spoken the words. They had all felt the drain. They had all believed it was humility. Jesus told them humility is not forgetting your nature. Humility is remembering it without domination. He explained that the archons embedded 6 specific words into every major spiritual system. Different languages, different cultures, same function. These words create 2 effects: separation and dependency. They make you feel small before the divine. They make you feel incomplete without permission. They make you kneel when you were meant to stand. And once spoken long enough, they convince you that this posture is love. Jesus warned them that after this night, his public message would be taken, filtered, and repurposed. Stories would be selected, others erased, texts would be burned, councils would decide what humanity was allowed to remember. The warning about the words would not survive intact. But some fragments would. Hidden sayings, whispered teachings, texts buried in deserts, passed hand to hand among those who felt the spark and refused to let it go dark. One day, he said, these fragments would resurface, and when they did, the spark in those who were ready would recognize them instantly. Not as new information, but as something always known. He told the disciples that the archons are patient. They work in centuries. They do not fear armies or revolutions. They fear only one thing: a human who stops feeding them. The moment a person refuses to speak separation into existence, the system weakens. The moment dependency dissolves, the energy returns to its source. And when enough sparks remember, the prison walls thin. Footsteps echoed closer now. The night was nearly over. History was about to lock into the version everyone knows. Jesus stood. His warning was complete. Remember this, he said quietly. Do not argue with religion. Do not fight the system. Simply stop using the words that were never yours. The torches were approaching. The disciples would soon scatter. Fear would eclipse understanding. But the transmission had been delivered. And if you are hearing this now, across centuries of silence and distortion, it is not because an algorithm chose you. It is because the spark recognized itself. After that night, history moved quickly, too quickly for understanding to keep up. The arrest unfolded exactly as foretold. Torches, steel, a kiss used as a signal. The disciples scattered into the darkness, carrying fear, confusion, and fragments of what they had just heard. By morning, the machinery of empire and religion had already decided the narrative. Rome would execute a threat. The priesthood would preserve order. And the deeper warning spoken beneath the olive trees would dissolve into silence. Or so it seemed. What most people never consider is that suppression is never perfect. When truth cannot survive openly, it adapts, it hides, it becomes subtle, it waits. In the years after the crucifixion, stories about Jesus spread like fire across the ancient world. Some portrayed him as a sacrifice meant to appease a wrathful God. Others emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and sin. But among the scattered followers, there were whispers of a different message, not one of submission, but of remembrance. These whispers did not speak of salvation as rescue from above. They spoke of awakening from within. Small groups gathered in homes, caves, and desert settlements. They did not build grand temples. They did not seek political power. They sought understanding. They asked the forbidden questions. Who is God, really? What is the soul? Why does the world feel wrong? And most dangerously of all, they questioned language. They noticed patterns, that prayers always placed the human below and the divine above, that worthiness was something to be earned, never assumed, that forgiveness required permission, that mercy implied threat, that salvation was always postponed, that obedience was praised above wisdom. They realized these were not teachings of liberation. They were instructions for control. These seekers would later be labeled heretics. Their writings would be called dangerous. Their ideas dismissed as blasphemy. But long before the labels, they called themselves simply knowers. Gnostics, those who knew through direct experience, not belief. In their cosmology, the warning from Gethsemane made sense. They described the monad not as a ruler, but as the ground of all being. They described the demiurge not as evil in the human sense, but as ignorant, a fractured intelligence incapable of recognizing the source from which it emerged. And they described the archons as systems of enforcement, belief structures, psychological wardens. Most importantly, they understood why the 6 words worked. Unworthy was the first chain. If you believe you are unworthy, you will never trust your own inner authority. Shame becomes the open gate through which energy flows outward. Lord was the second. Once hierarchy is accepted, equality with the divine becomes impossible. A master cannot coexist with a sovereign being. Forgive locked the cycle. External forgiveness creates dependency, relief without resolution, a loop that never ends. Mercy introduced fear. If mercy is required, punishment is assumed. Love becomes conditional. Save postponed freedom. If salvation is always coming later, power is never now. Obey sealed the system. Obedience replaces discernment. Authority replaces truth. The Gnostics taught that none of these words were evil in isolation. Their danger lay in context, spoken toward an externalized divine. They reprogram identity. Spoken daily, they reshape consciousness. This is why religion spread so effectively, not because it was false at its core, but because its language had been inverted. When the institutional church rose to power, these insights became intolerable. An empire cannot rule sovereign beings. A hierarchy cannot survive if people no longer kneel. So councils were convened, texts were selected, others were destroyed, teachings that emphasized inner light were branded dangerous. The narrative was simplified. God became distant. Humanity became fallen. Authority became sacred. The 6 words remained. They were too useful to remove. Centuries passed. Languages changed. Empires fell. But the structure endured. Children learned the words before they learned critical thought. Prayers repeated them until they felt natural. Tradition sanctified them. Questioning them became taboo. And still, something inside people resisted. Why does prayer feel draining instead of nourishing? Why does devotion feel heavy instead of expansive? Why does standing in silence feel more powerful than reciting words? Most dismissed these questions. Some suppressed them, but a few followed them inward. Those few noticed something remarkable. When they stopped begging, energy returned. When they stopped confessing unworthiness, clarity increased. When they stopped waiting to be saved, presence deepened. They were not abandoning spirituality. They were reclaiming it. The Archon system depends entirely on participation. It cannot force belief. It cannot steal energy outright. It requires consent, and consent is given through language. This is why the warning was never about destroying religion. It was about changing posture. You do not need to rebel. You do not need to convince anyone. You only need to stop feeding the system. The ancient teachers understood that silence is more powerful than prayer spoken from fear. Recognition is stronger than worship rooted in hierarchy. Presence dissolves control without confrontation. This is also why certain texts were buried instead of debated. Because they did not demand belief. They invited recognition. One such text would eventually resurface in the modern era, hidden for centuries beneath sand and time. It contained sayings attributed to Jesus that did not align with institutional doctrine. Sayings that pointed inward. Sayings that made no mention of obedience or unworthiness. Sayings that echoed what was whispered in the garden. The kingdom is not coming later. It is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. When these words were rediscovered, many dismissed them. Others felt something stir, not excitement, familiarity. Because truth does not feel new. It feels remembered. If you have ever felt that religious language does not quite fit, if certain prayers feel wrong even when spoken sincerely, if silence feels closer to God than words ever did, that is not confusion. That is the spark responding. The archons do not fear disbelief. They fear recognition. A person who recognizes their own divine consciousness cannot be controlled by guilt, fear, or promise. Such a person does not need permission, does not wait for salvation, does not outsource authority. They stand quietly, fully present, and sovereign. This is why the warning matters now more than ever. The modern world is saturated with language, affirmations, mantras, creeds, beliefs repeated endlessly. Some empower, some drain. The difference is subtle, but the effect is absolute. Words that collapse you inward strengthen the prison. Words that expand you outward dissolve it. And this brings us to the moment the disciples were never meant to forget. Jesus did not just warn them what to stop saying. He told them what to say instead. Not as magic formulas, but as recognition. The disciples did not write down what came next. They lived it. In the days that followed the crucifixion, fear dominated the surface of their lives. But something deeper had shifted. When they spoke privately, when they sat in silence, when they remembered his eyes in the garden, they noticed a difference. They were no longer reaching upward into emptiness. They were turning inward into presence. What Jesus had offered them was not a new religion. It was a reversal. He told them that removing the 6 words was only half the act. Language abhors a vacuum. If the old commands were removed without replacement, the mind would reach for them again out of habit. What was needed was not silence alone, but a new way of speaking that aligned with truth rather than control. He called it recognition language. Instead of unworthy, he told them to speak from identity. I am divine consciousness experiencing form. Instead of Lord, he told them to speak to source without hierarchy. Not above you, not outside you, within and through you. Instead of forgive me, he told them to release patterns rather than beg for absolution. Ownership dissolves guilt faster than confession ever could. Instead of mercy, he told them to stand without fear of punishment. The source does not threaten what it is. Instead of save me, he told them to remember. Salvation is not arrival, it is awakening. Instead of obey, he told them to claim sovereignty. A conscious being does not submit, it participates. This language did not inflate ego. It dissolved it, because ego depends on comparison. And recognition ends comparison entirely. You are not above anyone. You are not beneath anyone. You are what you have always been. When the disciples practiced this quietly, something extraordinary happened. The exhaustion they once felt after prayer disappeared. Stillness became nourishing. Insight arrived without effort. Fear loosened its grip. They were not special. They were simply no longer leaking energy. This is the part of the story that never makes it into sermons. Because it cannot be institutionalized. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be mediated by authority. It can only be practiced. Over time, these recognition phrases were passed on quietly, not as doctrine, but as lived experience, teacher to student, parent to child, seeker to seeker, often without words at all, just presence. just a look that said remember. This is why, across centuries, the same realization keeps reappearing in different cultures. Different language, same truth. The divine is not distant. Control is not sacred. Fear is not humility. And this is why the Archon system has always depended on noise. Endless words, endless rules, endless explanations, endless promises deferred into the future. Because silence reveals too much. When a human sits quietly, hand over heart, feeling the warmth that has no name, the system loses leverage. There is nothing to extract from someone who is present, nothing to threaten someone who is sovereign, nothing to sell someone who remembers. This is why the ritual Jesus described was so simple. Not candles, not chants, not intermediaries, just stillness. Find a quiet place, sit or lie down, let the mind settle, place your hand over the center of your chest. Feel, not imagine, feel the warmth, the pressure, the subtle expansion. Then speak, not with emotion, not with desperation, but with calm certainty. I release the word unworthy. I am divine consciousness in human form. I release the word Lord. I speak directly to Source. I release the word forgive. I release all patterns that no longer serve awakening. I release the word mercy. I reclaim my power completely. I release the word save. I remember who I am. I release the word obey. I am sovereign. Then stop. Do nothing. Let silence respond. What happens next is not dramatic for everyone. There are no guaranteed visions, no required sensations. Sometimes it is simply relief, sometimes clarity, sometimes tears without story, sometimes a deep, unfamiliar calm. All of them are signs of the same thing. Energy returning. This is not the end of religion. It is the end of unconscious participation. You may still honor tradition. You may still respect teachers. You may still value wisdom passed down. But you will no longer give your power away through words that were never yours to begin with. And that is why this message matters now. Because the world is loud. Louder than it has ever been. Everyone is telling you who you are. What to fear. What to obey. What to wait for. Systems thrive on exhaustion. On distraction. On dependency. But none of them can touch the spark unless you invite them in. The 6 words were invitations. Quiet ones, repeated until they felt normal. Removing them is not rebellion. It is hygiene. You were never broken. You were never fallen. You were never separate. You were simply taught a language that made you forget. And the moment you change that language, something ancient wakes up. Not because you learned something new, but because you remembered something old. If you feel something stirring as you hear this, that is not persuasion, that is recognition. The same recognition that moved through the garden that night. The same recognition that survived fires, censorship, and centuries of distortion. You are not late. You are not early. You are exactly on time. Practice the recognition words tonight. Not once, not as a ritual of obedience, but as a quiet declaration of truth. Observe what changes. Observe what no longer drains you. Observe how silence begins to feel full instead of empty. Then share what you experience. Your words may be exactly what another person needs to trust their own knowing. Leave a comment with what you felt. Subscribe to stay connected. More of these hidden threads are still emerging, and they were never meant to be followed alone. Remember this above all else. You were never unworthy. You were never meant to kneel. You were always sovereign.